Okay, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Wednesday, February 12th. And is the Middle East about to explode?
It's always about to explode. Um, well,
More,
I,
more
I don't know.
so
There's
now,
definitely a
though?
lot going on. I mean, it's just one thing we've learned. I remember, I think it was maybe a couple episodes ago, we discussed Trump's real estate deal for Gaza. Right? He was going to buy it and own it, and we're thinking, well, maybe he doesn't quite mean that. Well, in the subsequent days, he made clear that he did mean it. He repeated that again and again. I think yesterday he did, or the day before. Um, so yeah, he seems to be quite open about that. And then even more, I think a greater cause for concern is the fact that the ceasefire appears to have broken down, and it looks like hostilities will resume. Um, of course, the Israelis and Trump are pinning it all on Hamas. Trump has threatened to make uh, I can't remember the exact words were, but it was going to be hell for Gaza if they don't give all the hostages. And he made it clear he's talking about all, not the three that are scheduled to be released on Saturday. But if by Saturday at noon they don't release all the hostages, it'll be hell for them. Um, and the Israelis, are making moves already to go back in and resume the attack on Gaza. No, one thing is, it just seems so very clear to me. It's just so obvious for anybody that's paying attention. Okay, that this is phony. It's not that Hamas has actually breached the ceasefire deal. Yeah, Hamas stated that they would delay the release of the hostages because the Israelis were not honoring the ceasefire deal, and that's true. It's not just one or two minor points, but one of the most important things is the humanitarian resumption of humanitarian supplies. And the Israelis have been letting some things in, but not nearly enough. Just to give you an example, they were supposed to provide 200,000 tents. It's a winter there. It's not cold like it is, you know, in Northern Europe or anything. But it's if you don't have shelter, it rains, it gets cold, and if you're already sick, you can die.
Hmm.
Um, so they were supposed to provide 200,000 shelters. To my knowledge, they've only provided 10% of that, 20,000. They were supposed to provide 60,000 housing units. Maybe those are trailers or something like that. They haven't provided any. They were supposed to let patients out of the country. We're talking about many thousands or tens of thousands. They've only allowed a very, very small fraction of those patients to leave the country to get treatment in places like Egypt. Um, and the list goes on and on and on. They have, and then on top of that, they've actually shot and killed something like 50 people have been killed in Gaza since the ceasefire began. So Israel has not been honoring it. And then let's not forget that Netanyahu himself has been saying that I won't honor, we'll go back in. He's been saying that. So now if you actually believe this claim that, oh, there's a breach, we have to go back in, it's been his intention all along. And the sad thing is that Trump seems to be going along with him.
Well, yeah, that's the question, though. Is Trump aware of all the failures of Israel to abide by the ceasefire agreement? I mean, let's remember this was a ceasefire deal that was brokered by Trump and
Right.
Witkoff. This was something that Trump claimed, like, look what I did. I'm bringing
Right.
peace. And shouldn't he
Yeah.
be aware that it's the Israelis breaking the ceasefire agreement,
He
or is he not
might be,
aware?
he may not be. I get the sense with Trump that he watches Fox News, and that's his main source of information. As incredible as it may seem, I recall back during his first term, there was a claim that the Syrian government had used chemical weapons against its own people, and that it was presented that way as fact, of course, on the mainstream news. Now, I remember reading some stories back then, news stories that said that Trump, in fact, had been briefed by the CIA, who said that it's not clear that that was true. They said they didn't have evidence, any clear evidence that the Syrian government had done this. But he ignored that and he went with a news story. and he bombed Syria. This was very early in his first term, and I remember that was sort of a when he did that. I had been very hopeful about Trump because a lot of his rhetoric was encouraging, but he went and he did the same old thing. And later, a story came out that it was actually Melania came to him, who had been watching TV and in tears, and said, "You got to do something about it for the children of Syria or whatever." So he bombed Syria and killed a bunch of children. That's So I think it's quite possible that he doesn't really know. He doesn't really, it's just like he's not really interested in knowing the facts. He's just not that kind of guy. And yeah, okay, this is inconsistent. He had a ceasefire deal going, and but that's Trump. He's inconsistent. I mean, that's the hard thing. He says things that give cause for hope. Sometimes he really does go against the mainstream. He speaks forbidden truths, and he may take a step in the right direction, but often he doesn't follow through. This wouldn't be unusual for Trump.
How do you think this is going to play out? Trump is playing hardball, a real hard line. All the hostages. He set a date, noon on Saturday. I assume this is probably Eastern time, United States, noon.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it is. I think that was actually part of the ceasefire, that the Hamas was scheduled to release 3 more hostages on that day. And they stated that they were going to delay it because the Israelis weren't holding up. Were breaching the ceasefire deal, especially with respect to humanitarian aid. And that, Israel had to start providing this aid that they had promised. That was part of the deal. And until, if they started doing that, then those 3 hostages would be released. And that's the excuse that the Israelis are now using for going back in. And I think it's that scheduled release time that Trump is pointing to. So I think it would be noon, Israeli time.
Well, I guess the big question is do you think that Hamas is going to release the prisoners, the hostages? Or is this...
It's a tough, they're in a really tough position. Clearly the Israelis are just not keeping their part of the bargain. Just like the same is true, of course, up in southern Lebanon. It just feel like they don't feel bound by these bargains at all. These deals, these agreements. Yet on the other hand, the alternative is so horrible. The resumption of this, the attack on their people, and maybe a renewed ethnic cleansing. They just might cave in. It's not impossible. They may very well, just because they're really stuck between a rock and a hard place. But another thing to consider is that, Trump's statements about relocating is really ethnically cleansing all of Gaza and taking ownership of it. Undoubtedly, Hamas has heard this, of course. And so they say, why are we going ahead with a ceasefire deal if, when it's all over, they're just going to take the place and they're going to drive us out?
But they can't, right? They can't do it unless they...
I don't think Israel could. I think it was clear that they were at least planning to ethnically cleanse northern Gaza. And I think that's still, now it's going to be more difficult. Hundreds of thousands of people have moved back in, but they've shown a willingness to ethnically cleanse in the past. They just might do it. And they have, this clearly ironclad support from the U.S. administration. And they may just feel that that's enough. They don't care what the rest of the world says. Now, it's going to be hard, for, I think, again, the reasons that we stated earlier. There was a sense of relief in much of Israel, not all, the ultranationalists, which are a very powerful faction there, and do, I think, represent a considerable portion of the population, were upset about the peace deal. And apparently many of the IDF soldiers were upset about it. They felt like their work hadn't been done. They were going to ethnically cleanse this place and claim it for Israel, and now they were told to pull out. And so those people are angry, but much of Israel was just breathed a huge sigh of relief, and mainly because they wanted to see the hostages brought back. And my understanding is that extends to even Miriam Adelson, the Trump's biggest financial supporter. So it is going to be, again, Netanyahu has made this calculation. It was clear that he was intending to break this all along. We're wondering if he could, because Trump seemed to be, back then, at least, we were hearing reports that actually he wanted to go through with the ceasefire, wanted it to go into the next phase. So we didn't know who was going to win this battle, but it appears that Netanyahu has won it, or Trump has just simply chosen to, has changed course. He's erratic. Let's be honest. I think there's a tendency always to think he's playing 3D chess, but sometimes he's just erratic and inconsistent.
Does anyone in the world support the U.S. decision with claiming Gaza, owning Gaza, ethnically cleansing Gaza? I think we need to be clear exactly what are the intentions of Trump. It sounds so extreme, but he's reiterated again and again that the idea is that everybody in Gaza has to leave.
Right.
And they can't come back.
Right.
Right. That is the official stance of the U.S. government.
Right.
Right.
But certainly of Trump, he made that crystal clear.
Is there any support in the world behind this decision at all, other than Israel? Does anybody?
I don't think so. I think it's the U.S. and Israel in this case. Now, there have been many votes taken in the UN where there was an overwhelming majority on the side of Palestine and Palestinian rights, and there was, typically there would be on the other side there would be the U.S., Israel, the Fiji Islands, and some other tiny sort of micronations, and that was about it. And we maybe it's probably the same thing now. Like if a vote was taken, it would be condemning this. The only ones that would be opposed to vote would be the U.S., Israel, and maybe a few of those dependencies. Even other states that typically are, act like vassals to the U.S., they can't go this far. They, like France or England or Germany, they're going to vote against it too, if this is put to a vote.
Right. This has always been kind of the objective of Israel. The creation of Greater Israel was to ethnically cleanse the land. That's what they've been doing slowly for a long time, and it's been picking up, but it's been quiet. So most of the world, people that haven't been paying attention to the conflict between Israel and Palestine, don't really understand. There's like, whoa, it's complicated.
Yeah,
what's going on over there? But now it's becoming very apparent that this is land grab. I mean, we're just saying it openly. You're just saying like, they got to go and they can't come back. There's not really any way to kind of whitewash this, I feel. So this has to be incredibly damaging for Israel and for the United States, right? That it's becoming so apparent. So I'm wondering, is there, how is this going to damage the United States on the global stage, its ability to engage in foreign policy?
Right.
How damaging is this, making these types of statements? And if we go through with it, will it really just destroy this? I feel like this could sink the Trump presidency if he mishandles this situation.
Well, yeah, if it means, a wider war in the Middle East at some point, it really could. But, unfortunately, I think within the U.S., it's going to be supported. I think a lot of people seem to think it's reasonable. But on the world stage, certainly not. Again, it's like Trump, I'm almost grateful for this. It's just like, again, as we've said many times, he says the quiet part out loud. And so in a way, he has a tendency, I think it's often unintentional, but he has a tendency to shine light on ugly truths. Sometimes because he himself believes in them, sometimes he opposes them. We've seen both. Like, we've talked about USAID, and but at least at the present time, he's on the right side of it. He may flip-flop in some way once he gets what he wants. But here, he is the supporter of this ethnic cleansing, but he spoke it out loud. It was clear that I think the fact is the U.S. has been complicit in ethnic cleansing, the West Bank for a long, long time. It's gone slowly, but we've just occasionally we wring our hands and utter a very, very mild criticism. But the aid keeps on flowing to Israel. The bombs and the fighter jets and all the weapons that are used against the occupied Palestinians. We've always been complicit in it. It's just that we understood sort of like I think you could say that what's happening in the U.S. is very kind of parallels what's happening in Israel. Because Israel was had up until very recently, that they understood that they could only go so fast and that they had to be careful how they spun things and presented things to the world. They had to use the language of human rights, and they were very successful in that enterprise. I think like anybody looked at it very carefully, reached the conclusion, hey, this is apartheid. This is, an illegal occupation. What are you doing? But if you didn't look carefully, or if you really didn't care, and they provided you with we'll say the kind of rhetorical cover. You could make a pretense of being a moral person, somebody concerned about human rights, and still be a supporter of Israel. But then in recent years, with the rise of the ultranationalists, that we could say rhetorical sophistication has been cast aside, and the Israelis have been talking bluntly, about genocide and ethnic cleansing, especially since October 7th, but before then. And now, they're now talking openly about just taking it all. The Greater Israel was something that was always there, and was voiced by certain sectors on the right. The rest of society didn't talk about it openly, but they, in fact, if you looked at their actions, they were carrying it out, just at a kind of in an incremental way. But now it's all pretense has been thrown to the winds, and you could say that Trump is just reflecting that. Now he's brought it to the U.S., and this is, in a way, I would say that's good, but it's also very scary. I mean, it's just that the danger is, okay, let's look at the possible upside, and I think there is. It's just that the world sees the truth. And a lot of those people who didn't want to see the truth before and were able to fool themselves because of the kind of the sophistication of the Zionists, now they're forced to see the truth. And maybe that will mean, we hope, more opposition, less to Israel, less support for Israel from other countries. And I think clearly we're already seeing that, and that trend should accelerate. But on the other hand, the danger is that you say it openly. You say these, you present the ugly truth, and your support for it. And people say, yeah, right. That's always been true. And then you actually, you end up actually breaking this taboo that, maybe covered up some of the truth, but also restrained actions to some point. You break the taboo, and, we enter into a new phase of history where these actions don't even need to be justified. It's just like there's a danger that we'll have that in the Trump presidency. Again, his talk about seizing Greenland and whatever. At first, it just seems like a joke, but it's repeated again and again, and then you see that he's really he's doubling down on the dispossession of the Gazans. We may be entering a very, very scary stage of history right now.
You say that most Americans think what he says is reasonable. You believe that's true? I mean, you just went through and explained very well how they use the language of human rights and all this, and now all pretense has been thrown to the wind, and now we're very open about it. And you said now Trump says the quiet part out loud. It's an open land grab is what you can hear him say. I don't think you can really debate it that much. Yeah. You said we'll own it, we'll control it. They have to leave and they can't come back. Like that, there's not really, I think, a lot of wiggle room in these statements he's making. And we've seen also Israel, they took, parts of Syria recently, and they've taken parts of Lebanon, and they're refusing to let it go. So it's just very clear that it's a land grab. So I'm just wondering, when you say a lot of Americans find it reasonable, how are they, what is it that they're thinking? What is the conclusion? I want to try to step in their shoes.
Yeah.
What is their argument? Why do they think this is a good idea? I understand just real, like the DEI, they're excited about that. All this corruption being exposed, fantastic. All right, we got border security. We're all on board on this. And then let's take Gaza and then
Yeah.
let Israel take Lebanon. And things like, wait, what happened to America first? Why is this
Right.
reasonable?
Yeah. Well, yeah. There's a danger, especially like we said, if the U.S. certainly sends in soldiers, but I think Trump has said that he's not going to do that. And he's just talking about it as like a real estate deal. And I think he in fact, even used the term real estate deal at some point in one of his talks. I mean, and it's so clear that he's thinking like a real estate mogul. I mean, it's really quite extraordinary. Um, um, yeah, I think Matt Ho I was recently listening to him, and he's saying that probably in Trump's mind, he envisions some sort of great gated communities in the Sinai, with maybe the big, and on the gate there's Trump in gold letters or something. And, I think probably he does. That's what he imagines. I just did the greatest real estate deal of all time. Um, so he does. Yeah, you say, well, I think if you look at it logically and with a real understanding of the situation, this is not in America's interest. But he does use the language of America first. That's why he's saying, we'll own it and, we'll have it developed and it'll be great. It's just like it's going to be just part of our adding it to the portfolio of American real estate holdings. But that's nonsense. Well, one thing is like he's being cheered by these ultranationalists in Israel. So they don't believe he's going to own it. They have no interest in America owning Gaza. For them, it's all about, it's Zionism, it's ownership by the Jews. And so, I think they'll kind of humor him, but they know in the end it'll be theirs. But if
But
they can get the U.S. to help them out in this, sure. But I think in the end, they know that it's their property.
I'm just trying to understand the American support for this. Do you really
Yeah.
believe there is American support for
Well,
this decision, or is it
yeah.
just sort of this cult of personality around Trump that
Yeah.
just they go
Well,
with
I say
whatever
it's
Trump
both.
says?
I think it's first of all, Zionism has been damaged in this country, especially among younger people, both on the left and the right. Especially on the left, but on the right too. There's interesting polls that have come out and showed that there's really been a diminution of support for Israel among younger Americans on all across the political spectrum. But Zionism remains a very powerful force in this country. And I think Zionists of all stripes, whether they're Christian Zionists, secular Zionists, Jewish Zionists, they will support this. And they unfortunately have a disproportionate amount of power. They control the commanding heights of the culture and of the economy. And so, at least in the short or medium term, I think there will be support. But it is dangerous. I mean, it's just like, again, when you rip the veil off, it just inevitably there are going to be people who were on the fence, or maybe even people that were somewhat thought they believed in Zionism, but then they started, wait a second, I don't know that I believe in this. And I think inevitably it's going to be damaging to the Zionist project here in this country. But at the present, it's just like there's just so much support, and it's so well entrenched in the establishment that that what he's saying is going to be supported.
Do you think most Christian Zionists really do have an understanding of what Zionism is what it's really all about, or is it just a very superficial understanding that, oh, my pastor told me that this was the land of the Jews, so we support it?
Yeah.
Is it pretty superficial like that, or do they know what's happening? Because I mean,
Yeah.
just the destruction of Christianity within the Holy Land is what is also happening. One of the
Right.
oldest churches in Christian churches in the world was bombed very early on in the
Right.
campaign in Gaza. This is not good for Christianity in the region as a
Right.
Christian. So it's
Right. Yeah, well, and I'd like to point out too that in southern Lebanon, it was like a tomb of Saint Peter as a place that by tradition has been revered as a tomb of Saint Peter by Christians for many, many centuries, and by Muslims too, who actually do revere Saint Peter as well. That was bombed by the Israelis. There was a cross on a mountain, in Syria that was a pilgrimage site for Christians for many, many centuries, and the Israelis destroyed it. They have, but I think they've learned that there's no repercussions unfortunately, among so many, let's say, evangelicals and especially Christian Zionists. They don't really regard Arab Christians as real Christians. That's the sad truth. Um, Orthodox, whether Orthodox or Catholic, um, or they just don't know, because this is not something that's reported widely. I think a lot of them probably even now would be surprised to learn that there are Christians, ancient Christian communities in these places. Unfortunately, the numbers of Christians has been dropping drastically over the last several decades, because of the Zionist onslaught, in large part because of the Zionist onslaught. But yeah, they just don't even, many of them don't know. Unfortunately, some do know and just don't seem to care. I think a lot of them, I'm sure that many of them are good people and are actually otherwise good Christians, and they just don't understand what's going on. But some of them, from their language, do to some extent, and they seem to have kind of adopted the bloodthirsty views of the Jewish Zionists. There's clearly quite a few Christian Zionists that just aren't bothered with the fact that all kinds of Palestinians, including women and children, are being killed.
How do the Israelis view Christians in the land? I mean, do they make just a distinction? They just hate all Arabs in the area equally, whether they're Christian or Muslim, or is there more enmity towards Christians in the area? Because
Yeah, I
I
don't think
see
that,
these
yeah,
things like,
right.
they believe Jesus is, burning in hell and excrement. I see these things and them spitting at the cross. And I wonder if is there more hatred towards Christians in the area by the Israelis, or a lot of the Zionists are just secular and we just want everybody out. Doesn't matter. We
Uh-huh.
don't care if you're
Yeah, I don't know if
Christian,
there's any more
Muslim.
hatred for Christians than there is for Muslims. I think by and large, they probably, like at least within, it seems like over time, they become less and less careful about, or less and less restrained about their actions against uh, Christian Arabs. Um, Initially, like one of the reasons that the fairly large Christian community remained in what's now Israel, I believe it was Nazareth. There was a large Christian community there, and during the Nakba, part of the ethnic cleansing campaign that was the Nakba back in 1948, included driving the Christians out of Nazareth. But then they got a phone call from somebody who said, "You don't do that, because the thing is, like everybody, all Americans, Christians understand what Nazareth is. This is, they don't know really much about your country, but if they learn that you're driving Christians out of Nazareth, that's going to hurt you." So they actually let them back in. Um, but it seems like over time, they have shown less and less restraint in attacking, because as I mentioned, the attack on the tomb of St. Peter, on the cross on the mountain in Syria. They've learned that, well, because Christianity in this country has undergone a transformation where the old line, the mainline denominations that did have, and the Catholics were part of that, and then some of the major Protestant denominations like the Lutherans, they still did have some sort of connection or, identification with the Christians in the Middle East and would speak out, but they have declined relative to these new denominations that have a very large Christian Zionist component. And so these Christian Zionists, to be honest, either they just don't seem to care, and it's just they're so fixated on bringing them, you know, moving the end times forward, bringing about the second coming through this sequence of events that they imagine need to happen, and a part of that is the creation of a greater Israel. And so they don't care if Christians get killed in the process. Yeah, let's be honest.
Right. I asked that question just because if you think about it historically, the Jews were persecuted under Christian nations. When they look back, they talk about the pogroms and things like
Hmm.
this. We're talking about European countries. I feel like historically there wasn't
Yeah.
really much beef between Jews and Muslims. Or is that not true? So that's why I was wondering, like, are they kind of this,
Right.
from the European, the Holocaust, the pogroms, they come
Yeah.
back here and like, yeah, we, part of being Jewish is your resistance to Christianity, to, like that. That's part of what it was. So I was wondering if that had something to do with it, but I don't know.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it doesn't really make sense for me. That history has been forgotten. I mean, and now that the main supporters of Israel are in Europe and the United States, among nominal Christians, and you can't say that the Muslims didn't persecute Jews, but certainly, like in recent history, let's say, like we're talking about the Ottoman Empire that ruled the area for quite a long time. Um, yeah, you didn't find anything comparable to some of the persecutions in Europe, especially under Hitler. But that's, it seems like that just doesn't matter. It's a new world, and they have new alliances and new enemies.
It's Yeah, I wonder. I just feel like everything that's happening in the Middle East with Gaza and Israel. I feel like this is something that really can tear America apart. And the path that Trump's going down is scary. He's making these comments about Gaza. First of all, just the open land grab that we're going to own it. But he also uses this language like, look at the place. It's completely destroyed. It's unlivable. It's a
Hmm.
demolition site. He
Yeah.
keeps on saying that, which is like,
Right.
you do realize that that's because it's our bombs that we're giving
Right.
to Israel to drop on
Yeah.
them.
Right.
And now
Yeah.
you're saying, you're giving evidence to what most of the world, I would say, pretty much the whole world agrees is a genocide, right? I mean, is that fair to say? The majority of the world, I think only Americans
And
don't,
some
the majority,
well, and some Western European governments certainly,
yeah, governments,
especially
but
Germany.
in
Yeah.
terms of, but just the majority populations of every
Yeah.
country, I think the majority populations of every single country except the United States,
Yeah. Yeah. I'm not quite
views,
sure. Yeah. Maybe that it's not quite a majority in some European countries, but there's at least a substantial minority that recognizes, the Israeli
right.
actions as a
I,
genocide.
I understand, genocide is a very polarizing word, but it's something that a lot of people say it's at least started to look a little bit like genocide. It doesn't,
Right.
it's being associated with that at least. So
Right. Yeah.
whether
No
you want
question
to say
about it.
mass murder, ethnically cleansing, it's clearly not a good look, but he's making these open statements about just the state of Gaza. And we realize the world is like, yeah, well, you did that. You do realize,
Yeah.
Trump,
Yeah.
you're sitting there with
Yeah.
Netanyahu saying, oh man, it's so terrible. They
Right.
can't live there. It's unlivable. It's like, yeah, it's you two, these two
Yeah.
guys, it's
Yeah.
well, not
Yeah.
really, I shouldn't point at Trump. It was Biden before, but it will
Right.
continue under Trump. So there's no self-reflection on that.
Yeah.
And
And
then
it
I'm just,
was right. It's very true.
right. So, and then I'm just thinking, we had, Joe Biden was getting that nickname Genocide Joe, and I just think like Trump, you want to be associated with this too, become
Yeah.
Genocide Trump if this
Right.
comes along, and then it makes me think about what will happen to Christianity in this country, in America, where if it's tied to a genocide of the Holy Land,
Yeah.
of the people of the Holy Land, it's
Yeah. Yeah. No, it could have huge repercussions. It could. There's no question about
Do you
it.
think it could kill, basically, end or change what? I mean, I don't even know what Christianity really would be in this country at some point. Like, will it change? I mean, you feel like Europe really isn't so much of a Christian continent anymore,
Right.
and then the U.S. is kind of this. I'm going off into just into the weeds a little bit, but it feels like it's something different here in the United States. It doesn't feel like a Christian nation, and
Yeah.
it's
No.
evolved.
I
in a
think we
sense.
clearly aren't a Christian nation. We're a post-Christian nation. There are a lot of nominal Christians. I don't want to judge. I consider Christian Zionism to be a very serious deformation of the Christian faith. And it's not consistent with the historical Christian faith. It's a very recent invention. And I think it's going to be, it's a real black mark on Christianity, and as you say, I think like over time, as the true horror of this becomes increasingly obvious and maybe eventually just undeniable, even to some of the most extreme advocates of Zionism, it will, people will become aware of what these nominal Christians have associated themselves with, and many of those Christians, we hope too, will become aware of it. And yeah, there will be huge repercussions. I'm not going to even pretend to say what it will be, but it's there.
And you think it will happen, right? I mean, this is something that we're marching down this road, right? I mean,
No, it's not going to end the way they imagine it. We're not going. Jesus isn't going to come and establish an earthly kingdom in Israel after the greater Israel has been established. That's just not going to happen. It's going to be a very ugly ending, whatever it is. And I think there's a great deal of rationalization. There has been all along, but at some point, maybe even the most avid rationalizer on behalf of Christian Zionism will have to give up, and we'll see. That'll be a real sea change, a real earthquake, a cultural and political earthquake in this country, because it's so much a part of the landscape. It's just so much a part of the American identity now. But yeah, at some point, that's where I think we're headed, to that earthquake.
Is there a way we can get off that? I mean, I think it's just if we could stand up to Israel, right? I think that's the only way.
Right. Well, there was just a little bit of hope, which we've talked about, because Trump has that forceful personality where he really could change the direction of things. And the fact that he, had kind of secured his right flank, he had out Zionist the Zionists. Well, yeah, I found that very disturbing. But on the other hand, it's sometimes those people that can actually make a change, because they actually are in a stronger position. And I think we saw that at least vis-a-vis Netanyahu in the short run. But as I always pointed out, it's not that Trump is not committed to Zionism. That's the problem. If he actually could take on Zionism, he could be a real he could do some real damage. I think maybe more than anybody, just because the force of his personality and where he's positioned. But I don't see that happening. I just don't see it happening. Unfortunately, he's really totally on board with the Zionist program and with Greater Israel, and his comments about Gaza just make that clear. So, again, the narrative needs to change, but you need some, I don't see any hope of that happening from the top. Maybe there's got to be a change over the generations from the bottom. And we do see those trends taking place again. It's like, I think more than half of the Democratic Party was opposed, even under Biden. And I imagine it's even greater now that we have Trump in charge. More than half were opposed to supporting Israel in the Gaza campaign. And, though on the Republican side, unfortunately, you didn't see that among younger Republicans, there's a growing dissent on the whole question of Israel.
So let's just go back to what's coming up very soon in 3 or 4 days, Saturday noon. If the hostages aren't released, it sounds like it's basically a green light that Trump has given to Netanyahu to resume the bombing campaign of Gaza and to continue. I mean, there's nothing left, and they're just going to be bombing it again. And just wondering, and also just these statements that Trump has made that, it's a demolition site. So now you're bombing a demolition site. It's like, so what are we doing here at this point? Like, are you really going after Hamas, or is this just, and they're talking about cutting off water, cutting off electricity, starving them out. It's like, this is getting to a point where I don't want America to be associated with this. I don't want.
Again, it's really not so different from what was happening under Biden, but it's particularly, I think it's just particularly stark at this point. We had the ceasefire.
Because
it's had already the demolition site. Now we're going in and we're talking openly about ethnic cleansing. It used to be whispered, it was something that they talked about behind closed doors, and now he's saying it out loud. And that could be good in some senses, like I was saying, but it's also very scary in other senses.
Right.
I was just thinking also with, his talk about, it's almost like he's offering them a compassionate solution. If he was a third party who really wasn't part of this conflict, you might even say that you could argue, okay, this is okay, this is certainly a suboptimal solution, but things are so awful in Gaza. I think, truth be told, and I know that Matthew Ho has pointed out, there are Palestinians who just want to get out, especially those with children. They say, and I can't blame them. If I were there, I might just say, this is just so awful. It's so unjust. This is wrong. This is my land, but we can't just all die. If we can live in a gated community in the Sinai, that's a terrible injustice. But maybe just for the sake of my children and my own life, I'll just have to submit to that. So you could even argue it's a compassionate solution. But the problem is that we're not a third party. We're the ones who are making it hell. So it's just like, okay, we'll keep on killing you until you agree to the solution. This is the cruel reality.
Right. Okay, so we'll see what happens on Saturday. But the other option is that, okay, maybe Trump, he gets it and all the hostages are released. What next then? What does that mean for Gaza then? I mean, Israel's still has that statement, we are going to utterly destroy Hamas, which is just a way to destroy the civilian population, though, is what it seems like they're doing.
Right.
So,
well, the hard thing, it's hard to say what would happen. Part of the problem is, okay, we met your terms, so they were completely unreasonable. You've broken the ceasefire. We haven't. We've gone beyond it. We've released all the hostages. And you just kind of throw yourself on the mercy of the Americans. But the thing is, both the Americans and the Israelis look at that and they think, weakness. Now we can get even more from them. We can just apply the screws, tighten the screws, and now we'll get like the Hamas itself to surrender. I think that would probably be the next demand. And it's not just like, okay, now everything's all right. I think they just say, okay, they actually gave us what they want. Boy, they must be desperate. Now we can push that much harder.
So what do you think? If you're just a betting man, do you think that the hostages are going to be released, or do you think that come Saturday, all of a sudden, boom, this weekend,
right?
It's just happening all over again.
It's possible that Hamas may choose, though. I think they're very much in their rights to delay the release because, again, otherwise, how do they pressure the Israelis to keep their side of the bargain? And we're talking about humanitarian aid. We're talking about the lives of the Gazans. But it's possible that they just might cave in because a renewal of the hostilities, which is just such an awful thing to contemplate for their own people. And then they may give in. And I don't think that they would release all the hostages. Again, the terms of the ceasefire was, according to the terms of the ceasefire, they were supposed to release 3 hostages. Right? They should by Saturday. So I think it's possible they might go ahead and release those 3 hostages and then continue to, try to pressure, appeal. They're just in such a terrible situation because they're at the mercy of these people who will be honest, are just not honorable, and who have, are much more powerful than they are.
Right. Yeah. In the last episode, we just talked about the tactic of demonizing the other, not being able to have a nuanced discussion about Putin or Russia. Always have to preface it with some condemnation of Putin and Russia. And I feel the same thing is happening here in Israel, Palestine. There's this demonization of the Palestinians, and it's painful for me to hear, and I'm sure for you as well. We've both been to Palestine. We've spent time in the West Bank. They're just very nice people, and what's happening to them is just not right. It's not fair, and if you actually see it and you're there, it's heartbreaking. But you see this demonization constantly, and I just showed you that image that was posted on the State Department, official State Department Twitter, where it just said Hamas is evil, pure evil. Yeah. So that's where we're positioning this. Right. We can't have a discussion about the occupation, the right to resist, or anything like this. First of all, maybe we'll just start with there. What is your take on that? Do you say that Hamas is evil? Can we have a nuanced discussion about Hamas and its role in the region?
Yeah, Hamas is not evil. It's you can disagree with their policies. You may not share their ideology. I'm certainly not I'm not a Sunni Muslim, and I'm not But the fact is, let's say within Gaza, for example, there have been Christians there for a long time, and there still are. There was very small Christian communities, Christian churches, and they were protected by the Gazans. And in fact, when I was in the West Bank, good, what is it, 14 years ago, I remember that our group met with a Catholic priest from Gaza, and he talked about it. He said he had very good relations with them. Yeah, they're not madmen, bent on killing Christians or Jews for that matter. They understand that they're it's not just Jews. It's the problem really is the Zionists, which were, they're part of the world are almost entirely Jewish Zionists. You have a range of views at the top. There's some who support the two-state solution, the one that's been offered to them, which is actually a huge compromise. Again, we're talking about just 22% of the land of historic Palestine. They were supposed to get, approximately 50% of the land, according to the original UN resolution, which wasn't really fair because they had the majority of the population. But now we're just talking about 22% of the land. And Gaza itself is just a tiny strip. But there are Hamas leaders that have, voiced their acceptance to that, and I think the others could negotiate. I mean, again, the alternative is so terrible. Then you think about it, just that, okay, the kind of pressures that the Hamas government has been under are just been extraordinary. I think they're on a scale that we can't even fathom. They have been constantly under attack. They're completely dependent on these hostile powers, mainly Israel, for supplies, for everyday necessities, for water, for electricity, for food. And these powers are constantly restricting these supplies, sometimes it just seems out of pure sadism. They're just, we'll put them on a diet. I remember that was actually a comment of an Israeli leader. We'll put them on a diet for a while. Ha, ha, ha.
Yeah, I think they call it starvation plus diet is, I think, what they called it.
Yeah, right.
That's
so
right.
This is what they've been subject to, and then assassinations and repeated bombings. The mowing of the grass is like the Israelis call it, for many, many years. I was just thinking, like, in contrast to, like, the U.S. suffered the 9/11 attack, which was serious, but it was, for a country of our size, it was like a pinprick. But it led to, I would say, just it took us a big step closer to away from the real democracy and towards authoritarianism. All these various acts were passed, and the security state it grew greatly in size, and then we've learned, from the Snowden revelations, that virtually every American is being spied upon, and so on. Just like this one attack, it caused us to, and then of course the Iraq War. These were really hysterical responses. You think about that and just multiply it by 100,000 for the Gazans. The fact that Hamas is still, all in all, a functioning government that serves its people, and that's, you have to see that. I mean, it's just the Gazans do see Hamas as their representative who provides services to them. I mean, so sure, you can direct criticisms against it, but calling it a terrorist state is just, is not an objective statement. If you're going to call them a terrorist state, then Israel is doubly so.
So is Hamas quite popular amongst the Gazan population?
It is, and in fact, it's grown greatly in popularity in the West Bank too, because they see
Right.
that Hamas actually believes in Palestine, and whereas Al-Fatah, the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, they are just very corrupt, basically quislings, servants of the Israeli government.
So, I mean, a lot of people, I think, when they hear about Hamas, they just, say, yeah, it's evil, it's a terrorist organization, and they want to kill all of the Jews. They want to just wipe out Israel. But you're saying that actually they accept the two-state solution where they will give up.
Yeah, some of the leaders have. It's not. I think that they have. Over the last decade or so, have shown a willingness to accept it. And my belief is that if it was a serious offer was made to them, they would, because the alternatives are so terrible.
Okay, so you're saying that they are willing to negotiate.
Yeah.
That there is a solution. That they're not going to just necessarily
Yeah.
just
Well, yeah,
destroy
one thing
and
is clear, there's
massacre all.
no, you have to say there's just been no attempt to actually negotiate a solution. And that's on the Israeli side. They have deliberately tried to avoid that, as we've spoken about before. Whenever there's negotiations go forth, it seems like, or proceed, the Israelis, at least half the time, kill the lead negotiator on the other side. We've seen that twice since October 7th. They're not interested in negotiating a solution. The Israelis are not. Hamas is.
I'm sure you're blowing some people's minds right now.
Yeah, but it's
They don't
yeah.
want
Go
to.
look into it. I mean, serious. It's true.
Yeah, I know but if you watch,
Right.
if you watch mainstream media here in the
Yeah.
U.S., you watch Fox News, there's just this constant vilification, demonization. There
Yeah.
is no understanding of the history and what's going on there, and even I wish they would. Tucker Carlson, I would say kudos to him for at least
Yeah.
bringing up, for example, the Christian Palestinians there, because that I think is something that could resonate with a lot of Zionists in the United States. Like,
Yeah.
hey, these are Christians, and it was one of the things that really struck me when I was in the West Bank as well. I went to a church, a Catholic church there, and I think it was a Nablus. And we had our Arab guide that was Muslim, and he came into the church, him and his few of his other Muslim friends, and they were very reverent, hugged the priest, gave him a kiss on the cheek, and I was like, these guys are more pious Christians, even though they're not Christians, but very pious in a Christian church,
Reverential,
and
yeah.
reverential, and there was I was surprised about that, just like that this, and I was like, man, if my Zionist friends back home could see this, if they could understand what was going on here, but we just don't see it. An argument that a lot of people make, I see on Fox News sometimes, is that the Palestinians are just so awful. They're just such an evil people that even the Egyptians and the Jordanians don't want to take them in. That's just proof of how bad they are. They're so bad in Gaza that Egypt is like, no, we're not letting these terrorists into our country. How do you respond to that argument?
Yeah. Well, of course, in Jordan, we're talking about more than 50% of the population is Palestinian. It'd be much smaller, much smaller percentage in Egypt. Now, the thing you have to understand is that in both cases, it's the government that has this attitude. And why does it have? It wasn't the original attitudes of the government, but both governments have been bought off. Prior to, I think it was Al Nasser back in Egypt, they were strong supporters of the Palestinians and, very much opposed to Zionism. And then Sadat came in and we got the Camp David Accords. But what the Camp David Accords did, it was sort of like the Abraham Accords that are being talked about. It's just a way to normalize relations between Israel and neighboring Arab states, but at the expense of the Palestinians. So essentially, the Egyptians were bribed into giving up their opposition to Zionism in return for land that had been taken by the Israelis, and so it was returned to Egypt, but also to a very, very large foreign aid package from the U.S. I know that years ago, the U.S. was giving Egypt $2 billion a year. It's probably more now, decades ago even. Egypt, I know the last time I looked, was the second largest recipient of U.S. foreign aid. Why? It's all because of Israel. So you have a corrupt elite. As I've said in a lot of these countries, including Turkey, quite often you have an elite that's very pro-Western, but are very much at odds with the vast majority of the population. And that's true in Egypt. It's true in Turkey. But Erdogan has managed to he's a populist leader of some sort. So he is not simply a tool of the Western elite. I think he's, like with everything else, he balances them off against, the different forces within Turkey against each other, just like he does between different countries. Now in Egypt, you have President Sisi, who has, he is firmly pro-Western. He actually took power in a coup in which, again, a popularly elected official was overthrown. Again, so much for our support for democracy. It's kind of like Ukraine in that way. And he has firm control over the army. So you do have, the army, there's this elite, they are firmly in the Western camp. And they don't want to have the Palestinians there. Well, one thing, I think for them it's a fear that it will strengthen the anti-government forces. The Muslim Brotherhood is powerful or influential, let's say, within the Egyptian population, and the Muslim Brotherhood has close ties with Hamas. So they do regard them as mortal enemies. They don't want to have Hamas on their own land. So there is a danger, like if they did agree to allowing the transfer of a population from Gaza into Egypt, that that would strengthen their opponents. We'll just put that. It would strengthen the Muslim Brotherhood within their country, and they don't want to see it. Now, the position of the Jordanian king is even more precarious. And more than half of the population is Palestinian, and they are very, very upset about what's going on. And he just doesn't, he has maintained power being largely because of this economic aid that he's been receiving from the Americans. But his position is very precarious. And now if you let in another few 100,000 Palestinians, that just might tip the scales. That's his fear. And also, I think not just that it adds to the population there, the Palestinian population, but the general population, and I'm sure it's true of many of the other, non-Palestinian Sunni Muslims there, are just going to be angered that he actually was complicit in this ethnic cleansing. And you'll find the same thing in Egypt. It's not just that, these people have been moved there and they add to let's say, the opposing forces, but their populations are already upset at what's going on. And then you say you make this deal with the Israelis to conduct this ethnic cleansing. That's just going to kind of ratchet up the anger in general against these regimes. So it's a very dangerous thing for both of them. Now, I think it was yesterday that King Abdullah of Jordan met with Trump.
Right.
And they actually had some press conference afterwards, and they seemed to be, Trump seemed to be cheerful, and the Jordanian king was just was being very polite, and but he wasn't expressing opposition to Trump's plan. I mean, he was kind of dancing around it. They were talking about some sort of plan to transfer 2,000 Gazan children, I think, who are maybe hospital patients, and get them to different places in various different countries. And Trump said, we have this plan. He seemed to be very confident that his great real estate deal was going forward and that they were talking to the Egyptians. So, I would be surprised if they went along with it, but maybe he just has so much leverage, because it is going to be an existential threat to both of these regimes that they go along with the plan. But they just, maybe again, because they've made themselves into dependencies on the U.S., they just maybe in the end will decide that they just have to submit, because it's like a choice between, if they don't, then aid gets cut off and they're sure to go under. That's, I think, maybe the way they're looking at it. They don't want to do it. They know it's very dangerous, but they think maybe with U.S. support, they can survive.
Right. I think I saw this morning that Jordan said they reject the plan to remove the Palestinians from their homeland in Gaza.
Yeah.
So I did see the interview that he had with Trump, and accepting, very polite. I think it was just, my interpretation is political, but I don't think King Abdullah could survive if he said...
I don't think so either. Like I said, I think it's highly unlikely they're going to go along with this. But clearly the Americans are applying pressure, and let's not forget it happened under Biden too. It's not like there's a huge change in policy. The change is more in rhetoric between Biden and Trump. It's just like the substantive policy really hasn't changed.
Right. It's so frustrating, this Middle East conflict. I don't think people that are supportive of ethnically cleansing Gaza, I don't think they understand how precarious of a situation this puts Israel in and the United States. This really could really destroy the United States along with and Israel could just cease to exist if we have an uprising in Egypt and Jordan. Iran is shown that it could strike Israel with impunity. And we have even Yemen, is causing problems. Hezbollah can fire back. Like I think there's this feeling in the West, or at least in America, that somehow all the axis of resistance has been defeated. Iran has been crippled. Hezbollah's no more. Hamas is badly damaged. The Houthis aren't doing anything, and we're top dog again, and we can do what we want. And
Hmm.
that's a very dangerous line of thinking.
Yeah.
How precarious of a situation do you think this is for Israel and the United States?
Well, I think if Egypt and Jordan kind of remain in the Western camps, I think Israel still has the upper hand in the region. Um, and I think it has to be admitted that they have enjoyed some successes recently, namely the fall of Assad. That really does, and they seize some very strategic territory, the high mountains overlooking Lebanon, which really does give them a military advantage there. So, just like in a pure military sense, in the short run, I think they're in a fairly strong position. But if they push things too far, if they cause the downfall of Sisi's government in Egypt, Egypt is a very large country. It's very poor, but it's a very large country. And if it goes, if the Muslim Brotherhood takes control again, I think there's a chance that they're, I don't know, but it just really changes the strategic balance in the region. And that's a risk. That's one thing that they got to think about. Okay, you're going to twist the arm of Sisi. Maybe, just maybe, you can get him to do this. I don't think you can, but just maybe. But if you do, then what happens when this government falls? And then you find a Hamas aligned government in Egypt. That does change everything. And you end up being like, okay, you have the advantage because Assad fell, but now now this much larger country has gone into the other camp. Things are going to look pretty grim for them. And then the notion, I know that it's constantly stated that Iran is on the ropes. Yeah, they did suffer a setback because of the fall of Assad. But that was also, as I said, it was actually kind of a burden for them, as it was for Russia. They were supporting this government, these people, and it was costing them. Um, Now they don't have to. Now, I think it's a more of a setback for Hezbollah because again they relied on these the supply lines that ran through Syria and they can't rely on those anymore. And now they have the Israelis right up there in an expanded Golan Heights, and then a very hostile power to in the east that has actually already launched some attacks into Lebanon. There's been some border skirmishes. So yeah, the Hezbollah is in a precarious position again, but Hezbollah has proved to be very resilient. I wouldn't count them out. They fought very bravely and effectively against the Israeli ground invasion. You have to say that they really defeated that invasion. Now, I don't know, the future for them is uncertain, but I wouldn't count them out. And then Iran, going back to Iran, they are there's all these claims that started coming out later and later, but never with any sort of any evidence to back them up. Oh, that this Israeli attack was devastating. They knocked out all their S-300 sites or whatever. It's just like now they don't even have an air defense. Frankly, I just don't believe it. But it gets repeated now. It's just sort of like a known fact. But there was never any evidence supplied for it. And I think it's actually reversed for Iran, especially over over the long run, because they've inked the deal with Russia, and I think Iran is only going to get stronger over the months and years. So
Right.
it is, yeah, Israel is enjoying kind of like a temporary triumph. They're feeling good about what happened in Syria. They feel like this. They got the American president openly supporting their ethnic cleansing plans. Um, But yeah, it's you go down that path. The end result is not peace. I think it's just war, one way or another. It's just the rest of the Middle East can't support it. One thing is like this is done, like these statements about Gaza has, if Saudi Arabia had any idea, and they may have, because again, the leadership there is just, it doesn't really give a damn about the Palestinians. Um, MBS probably would like to make a deal with Israel, but he can't now. So they have come out with some very strong statements, unusually strong for the Saudis. The Saudis tend to be very, very cautious in their language. They're very polite, but they were very forceful in their denunciation of this Gaza relocation plan. And I think because they know that they can't go down this path. I mean, they put their own regime at great risk if they do. And I think it's true for all these countries. It's just like if the Israelis go ahead with it, it could it could set fire to the Middle East again. Especially if they force somehow some country to be complicit in this. I think that probably is going to mean the end of that particular U.S. Israeli aligned government, and it could, the consequences for Israel probably would be very, very negative.
Right. I don't see it ending well. We have very few friends left in the region, and the few that we do have, are there just because we bought them off, and they're in a very precarious situation.
Yeah.
They may not be our
Right.
friends for very long.
Right. And just for the U.S. too, you're saying this is going to damage the U.S. No question. I mean, it's just, again, I think like the support for these moves will be solid within the U.S., but the U.S. image, which has already taken a hit, is going to take another huge hit. And okay, maybe that doesn't make us, in the short run anyway, less powerful militarily or economically, but it does affect our soft power. That's been a great part of what has made us influential around the world. Our soft power is the image of the U.S. For some reason, we get these young people in every place, places in every place from Georgia to even Iran, or at least before October 7th in Iran, and all around the world you could have there was always a segment of the population that just looked to the U.S. led Western order, and it's going to be harder to convince people or to persuade them that we really are a benevolent power if we go ahead with this plan.
Okay. All right. Well, let's end it there, Dad.
Okay.
All right. Have a good rest of your day.
Okay. You too.
All right. Bye bye.
Bye.